It was a quiet summer evening in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, where screen doors are left unlocked and children's laughter fills the air until dusk. Life here was simple, predictable, safe, or so they thought. But on one particular evening, something changed. A silence fell. A silence so profound, so chilling, it would soon echo across the entire nation. This wasn't just another story on the nightly news. This was different. This was the story that would burrow its way into the heart of America, a story of innocence lost that would make even the most hardened law enforcement officers weep. Why this case? What was it about this particular darkness that touched so many souls? The answer, perhaps, lies in its very ordinariness. The victim was not a figure of power or fame. She was a child, a bright, smiling girl with a future that stretched out like an endless summer road. She was everyone's daughter, everyone's granddaughter, everyone's little sister. Her disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was a violation of a sacred trust. The trust that our children are safe in their own neighborhoods, on their own streets. When she vanished, it was as if a piece of the community's soul vanished with her. The story began with a simple, frantic phone call, but it would soon spiral into a national nightmare. It was a story that would ask a terrible question. If it could happen here, could it happen anywhere? The initial reports were confusing, filled with the panic of a family torn apart. A young girl, out for a bike ride, had simply disappeared. She was there one moment and gone the next. There was no struggle, no witnesses, just an empty bicycle lying on its side near a dusty cornfield. It was a scene straight out of a parent's worst nightmare, the kind of fear that clutches at your throat and refuses to let go. As the sun set, casting long, menacing shadows across the fields, a sense of dread began to settle over the town. The quiet hum of cicadas was replaced by the frantic shouts of neighbors and the wail of approaching sirens. The night was just beginning, and as the hours turned into a day, and that day turned into a week, the story spread. It was on every television screen, on the front page of every newspaper. The girl's smiling school picture became a symbol of lost innocence. People who had never met her, who lived thousands of miles away, felt a connection. They saw their own children in her eyes. They felt the parents' anguish as their own. The nation held its breath, praying for a miracle. They lit candles, held vigils, and tied ribbons around old oak trees. America was united in hope, but also in a growing, shared fear. The heartland was wounded, and everyone, from coast to coast, could feel the pain. The crime itself was a study in brutal simplicity. It began on a sun-drenched afternoon, the kind perfect for a bike ride. 10-year-old Jessica Lunsford was at home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. She had just finished her homework and was excited about a sleepover with friends. Her world was small, safe, and filled with the simple joys of childhood. But a shadow was lurking nearby. A shadow with a name and a face, though no one knew it yet. John Cooey, a man with a dark past, lived just down the road. He saw her playing, and in his twisted mind, a monstrous plan began to form. He was a predator, and he had found his prey. As night fell, the unthinkable happened. While Jessica slept in her bed, Cooey crept into her home. The house was quiet. Her father and grandmother were asleep in other rooms. He moved silently, a ghost in the darkness. He took her from her own bed, a place of dreams now turned into a scene of terror. He forced her out of the house and across the street to the mobile home where he was staying. There, in that cramped and squalid space, her ordeal began. It's a part of the story that is difficult to speak of, a darkness so complete it threatens to consume all light. For 3 days, she was his captive. What went through that little girl's mind? We can only imagine the terror, the confusion. She was just a child, ripped from her world and thrust into a nightmare. She told her captor she missed her family. She wanted to go home. He promised he would take her back. But it was a lie, a cruel, calculated lie. His fear of being caught was growing. He knew he couldn't let her go. He couldn't let her tell the world what he had done. And so, he made a decision that would seal her fate and shatter the hearts of millions. He decided she had to be silenced. Forever. He forced her to climb into a small, dark hole he had dug in the ground, hidden beneath his mattress. He made her clutch her favorite stuffed animal, a purple dolphin. And then he covered the hole. He sealed her in a makeshift tomb, leaving her to face the darkness alone. He left her there to die. He then packed a bag and fled, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. He left a little girl buried alive, just yards from her own home, while her family and an entire community searched desperately for her, praying she was safe. The longest night had begun, not just for Jessica, but for everyone who loved her. The news of Jessica's disappearance hit the small town of Homosassa, Florida, like a tidal wave. At first, there was disbelief. This kind of thing happened in big cities, on television shows. It didn't happen here, not in their quiet corner of the world. But as the hours stretched on, disbelief gave way to a gnawing fear. Flyers with Jessica's smiling face appeared on every storefront, every telephone pole, every car window. The entire community mobilized. Volunteers, hundreds of them, poured in from surrounding counties. They searched the woods, the swamps, the abandoned buildings. They were mothers, fathers, grandparents, teenagers, all united by a single, desperate hope to bring Jessica home. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fray. The mood in the town grew heavy, somber. The laughter of children seemed to fade from the playgrounds. People looked at each other with suspicion, with fear in their eyes. The trust that had once been the bedrock of their community was eroding. Who could have done this? Was it a stranger? Or, the more terrifying thought, was it one of their own? The media descended on the town, their satellite trucks lining the streets. The whole world was watching, and the pressure was immense. The community's private grief had become a public spectacle, and the weight of it was crushing. For the police, the emotional toll was immediate and overwhelming. These weren't just seasoned investigators, they were members of the community. They were fathers and mothers themselves. They saw their own children in Jessica's face. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey, the man leading the search, became a fixture on television, his face etched with exhaustion and a fierce determination. He spoke directly to Jessica, promising her they would never give up. His voice would often crack with emotion, and in those moments, he wasn't just a sheriff. He was a father, pleading for the safe return of a child. It was a raw, unfiltered display of emotion that resonated across the country. The tears were not confined to the sheriff. Seasoned detectives, men who had seen the worst of humanity, found themselves breaking down. They would return to the command center after a long day of searching, their boots caked in mud, their faces grim. They would look at the map on the wall, at the ever-expanding search grid, and the sheer hopelessness of it all would wash over them. They cried in their patrol cars. They cried at home, holding their own children a little tighter. This case was different. It wasn't just a job. It was personal. It was a wound that cut deep into their souls, and the entire town was bleeding with them. The investigation was a frantic race against time. From the moment Jessica was reported missing, thousands of leads poured in. The Citrus County Sheriff's Office, along with the FBI, set up a massive command post. The initial theory was that she had been taken by a stranger, a predator who had passed through the area. Investigators chased down every possible lead, no matter how small. They checked on registered sex offenders in the area, interviewed anyone with a criminal record, and followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. But, every lead turned into a dead end. It was like searching for a ghost, a shadow that had slipped through their fingers. The focus soon shifted to the area immediately surrounding Jessica's home. The search was painstaking and grueling. Divers combed the nearby lakes and ponds. K-9 units sniffed through dense woods and murky swamps. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanned the landscape from above. Yet, there was nothing. No sign of Jessica. No clue as to what had happened to her. The frustration mounted with each passing day. The investigators were working around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a desperate sense of urgency. They knew that with every hour that passed, the chances of finding Jessica alive grew slimmer. It was a heavy burden to bear. A key breakthrough, though they didn't know it at the time, came from a seemingly minor detail. A woman who lived in the mobile home park, a relative of John Cooey, came forward. She told police that Cooey had been staying with her but had suddenly left town around the time Jessica disappeared. She mentioned he had been acting strangely. At the time, it was just one lead among many, but investigators filed it away. They put out a bulletin for Cooey, wanting to question him as a person of interest. The search for him began, but he had already fled the state, leaving a cold trail behind him. The real turning point came weeks later, and it was heartbreaking. The search teams had covered the same ground over and over, but one detective had a nagging feeling about the mobile home where Cooey had been staying. It was just across the street from Jessica's house. Too close for coincidence. Acting on a hunch, they went back one more time. They searched the small, cluttered bedroom. And that's when they found it. Underneath the mattress, hidden beneath a pile of clothes, they saw the corner of a piece of plywood. They pulled it back, and the horrific truth was revealed. They had found Jessica. But it was too late. The search was over. For the officers on the scene, the discovery of Jessica's body was a moment that would be seared into their memories forever. The detective who first peered into that dark hole was a veteran, a man who thought he had seen it all, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He recoiled in horror, his face pale. The air grew thick with a collective gasp of grief. The scene was blessed by a priest before the forensic team began their grim work. As they gently lifted Jessica's small body from her makeshift grave, clutching her purple dolphin, the silence was broken by the sound of weeping. These were not just police officers. They were human beings, and their hearts were breaking. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey had to make the call he had been dreading for weeks. He had to tell Jessica's father, Mark Lunsford, that his daughter had been found and that she was gone. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do in his career. He later described the father's cry of anguish as a sound he would never forget. For Dawsey, the case became a personal crusade. He had looked into the cameras and promised he would find her. Now, he had to promise he would find her killer. The grief fueled a new kind of resolve, a cold, hard anger that would drive the investigation forward with relentless intensity. The emotional impact rippled through the entire department. Many officers took time off, unable to cope with the trauma. Counseling was offered to everyone involved. One officer spoke of going home and being unable to look at his own young daughter without bursting into tears. The case had stripped away their professional detachment. It had reminded them of their own vulnerability, of the fragility of the lives they had sworn to protect. They were no longer just enforcing the law. They were mourning a child they felt they had failed to save in time. The badge felt heavier than ever before. Even after the discovery, the work was not over. The officers had to process the scene, collect the evidence, and build a case that would stand up in court. Every piece of fiber, every fingerprint, was a sacred trust. They worked with a quiet, somber dedication. They were not just working for the state. They were working for Jessica. They were her voice now. They would ensure that the man who had stolen her future would face justice. The faces behind the badges were etched with sorrow, but also with an unwavering determination. They would not let her be forgotten. They would get justice for Jessie. With the discovery of Jessica's body, the manhunt for John Cooey intensified. He was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect in a horrific murder. The nationwide alert paid off. Cooey was spotted at a Salvation Army shelter in Augusta, Georgia. He was arrested without incident. When investigators from Florida arrived to question him, they found a man who seemed detached, almost vacant. He initially denied everything. But as the detectives pressed him, as they laid out the evidence and spoke of the little girl they had found, the dam began to break. The silence was about to be shattered by a confession of monstrous evil. The confession was chilling in its detail. Cooey calmly recounted the events of that night. He spoke of kidnapping Jessica, of holding her captive, of the fear and panic that led him to bury her alive. He spoke of it all in a flat, emotionless tone that horrified the seasoned detectives in the room. There was no remorse in his voice, no hint of guilt. It was as if he were describing a movie he had watched, not a crime he had committed. He even remembered the detail of her clutching her purple dolphin, a detail that had not been released to the public. They knew they had their man. As the details of the confession were made public, a fresh wave of horror and rage washed over the nation. The thought of a child being buried alive just yards from her home was almost too much to bear. It was a level of cruelty that was incomprehensible. The story dominated the news cycle for days. People were not just sad anymore. They were angry. They demanded justice. They demanded that something be done to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The case sparked a national conversation about the monitoring of sex offenders and the safety of our communities. For the officers who heard the confession firsthand, it was a deeply disturbing experience. They had to sit there, maintain their composure, and listen to a man describe the calculated murder of a child. It was a test of their professionalism and their humanity. After the confession was secured, one of the lead detectives reportedly walked out of the room, went to a quiet corner, and was physically sick. The evil he had just confronted was so pure, so profound, it had a physical effect. The confession had brought them the evidence they needed, but it had also left an indelible stain on their souls. The silence was broken, but what they heard was the stuff of nightmares. The legal battle that followed was long and arduous, but the outcome was never really in doubt. John Cooey was found guilty of kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. He would eventually die of natural causes on death row, but for many his death brought little comfort. It could not bring Jessica back. It could not erase the horror of what he had done. The verdict brought a sense of legal closure, but the emotional wounds, for the family and the community, would never fully heal. The scars from this case run deep, and they remain to this day. The case had a profound and lasting impact on law enforcement in Florida and across the country. In the wake of Jessica's murder, the Florida legislature passed the Jessica Lunsford Act. It was one of the toughest laws in the nation targeting sex offenders, imposing mandatory minimum sentences, and requiring lifelong electronic monitoring for those convicted of certain crimes against children. Police departments re-evaluated their protocols for missing child cases. The case became a tragic but powerful teaching tool, a reminder of the stakes involved and the need for a swift, overwhelming response. The promise Sheriff Dawsey made to Jessica's father, that her death would not be in vain, was fulfilled, at least in part. But beyond the laws and the policy changes, the true legacy of the case lies in its human impact. It changed the people it touched. Mark Lunsford, Jessica's father, became a tireless advocate for child safety, traveling the country to share his story and fight for stronger laws. The officers involved were forever altered. Many of them would say that this was the case that defined their careers, the one they would carry with them always. It taught them about the depths of human evil, but also about the resilience of the human spirit. It reminded them why they wore the badge in the first place, to stand as a thin blue line between innocence and the darkness. Today, more than 2 decades later, the story of Jessica Lunsford still has the power to shock, to sadden, and to make us hold our own children a little tighter. It serves as a permanent, painful reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in the quietest of towns. It's a story that broke the heart of a nation and made cops cry because it wasn't just about a crime. It was about the loss of innocence on a scale that felt personal to everyone. It's a scar on the American consciousness, a reminder of a little girl with a purple dolphin, and of a promise that we must never forget: to do everything in our power to protect our